In the summer of 1943, a group of Germany's finest automotive engineers gathered around a peculiar prize of war. Before them sat an American Jeep, captured intact from Allied forces in North Africa. These weren't ordinary mechanics, they represented the technical elite of the Third Reich, men who had designed some of the most sophisticated military vehicles in the world: the Panther tank, the Tiger, the legendary Mercedes staff cars that carry generals across conquered territories. Their assignment seems straightforward. Examine this crude-looking American vehicle, understand its construction, and produce a German equivalent. After all, German engineering was the envy of the world, their precision manufacturing, their attention to detail, their complex solutions to mechanical problems. These were the hallmarks of industrial supremacy. But as these engineers began their examination, they encountered something that would frustrate them for months, something that would challenge every assumption they held about proper engineering. The Jeep wasn't just simple, it was impossibly simple, and that simplicity, they would discover, was the most sophisticated design feature of all. This is the story of how American ingenuity defeated German perfectionism, not through superior technology but through a completely different philosophy of what made a vehicle truly great. It's a story about the collision of two engineering cultures and how sometimes the most brilliant solution is the one that refuses to be clever. The Jeep didn't look like much with its flat, angular body and exposed mechanical components. It appeared almost primitive compared to the curved, enclosed designs favored by European manufacturers. To eyes trained in classical automotive design, it looked like something a farmer might cobble together in a barn, but appearances, as the German engineers were about to learn, can be devastatingly deceiving. Music. To understand why this moment mattered, you need to grasp where Germany stood in 1943. There was still a formidable fighting force, but cracks were beginning to show. The Eastern Front was consuming men and material at an unsustainable rate. In North Africa, the Afrika Corps had been pushed back by Allied forces, and everywhere German commanders looked, they saw American Jeeps. These vehicles were everywhere, scouting ahead of tank columns racing through desert wadis, carrying supplies, mounting machine guns for mobile fire support, evacuating wounded from forward positions. The Jeeps were doing jobs that required 3 or 4 different German vehicles, and they were doing them with apparent ease. German field commanders filed report after report praising the Jeeps' capabilities. More troubling, they noted how often their own vehicles broke down compared to the American ones. The standard German equivalent, the wagon, was a fine vehicle in its own right. Based on the Beetle chassis, it was reliable and efficient, but it couldn't match the Jeep's load capacity, its off-road capability, or its sheer versatility. The German high command took notice. If they could understand the Jeep's design and mass-produce their own version, perhaps they could solve some of the logistical nightmares plaguing their armies. So they assembled a team of experts and presented them with a captured specimen. Leading the examination was a cadre of engineers from Mercedes and other prestigious firms. These men had spent their careers perfecting the art of automotive design. They understood metal stress analysis, precision tolerances, and manufacturing efficiency. They had created vehicles that represented the pinnacle of European engineering thought. Their task seemed routine: strip down the vehicle, measure every component, understand the design choices, create technical drawings, develop manufacturing plan. They had done this before with captured Soviet tanks, British trucks, American aircraft engines. Reverse engineering was a standard practice in wartime. What they didn't anticipate was that the Jeep would refuse to be understood through conventional engineering analysis. The problem wasn't that it was Too complex it was that it wasn't complex enough. The disassembly began methodically. Bolts were removed, components catalogued, measurements recorded in. With each piece they examined, the German engineers grew more confused. The engine was absurdly simple. Four-cylinder unit displacing just 134 cub-in, producing a modest 60 horsepower. By German standards, it was underpowered. For a vehicle expected to carry half a ton of cargo plus 4 soldiers, where was the sophisticated valve timing, the precision-balanced crankshaft, the carefully calculated compression ratios that German engines featured? None of it was there. The engine was almost crude in its simplicity, large tolerances between moving parts simple, valve arrangements basic. It looked like something from the previous decade of automotive development. But then the engineers checked the maintenance records that had been captured with the vehicle. This particular Jeep had logged over 12,000 mi in North African desert conditions. Sand, heat, primitive fuel, minimal maintenance, and the engine showed relatively little wear. How was that possible? They moved to the transmission again. Shocking simplicity, a 3-speed gearbox with a 2-speed transfer case. For four-wheel drive, German engineers had developed far more sophisticated transmission systems with more gears and smoother operation. The Jeep's transmission was almost agricultural, its directness, yet the gear ratios had been chosen with uncanny precision. Low rain provided incredible torque for climbing obstacles or pulling loads. High rain gave adequate road speed. The synchro mesh was robust rather than refined. Everything was built to survive abuse rather than provide smooth, quiet operation. One engineer noted in his reports, the transmission appears to have been designed by someone who has never read proper engineering textbook, yet the ratio selected showed deep understanding of practical vehicle operation. The suspension system caused even more consternation. It consisted of simple leaf springs, front and rear technology that European passenger cars had moved beyond years earlier. Independent suspension was considered superior, more comfortable, better handling. German military vehicles used more sophisticated setups, but those leaf springs were mounted in a way that provided enormous wheel travel. The Jeep could flex and twist over terrain that would high center more sophisticated vehicles. One engineer wrote, the suspension is crude but effective in ways our calculations would not have predicted. The frame was another puzzle. Built from simple channel steel, it flexed and twisted under load. German doctrine called for rigid frames. Precision and strength came from stiffness. A flexing frame was considered a design flaw, sign of inadequate engineering. Yet this flexing frame was clearly intentional. It allowed the vehicle to conform to uneven terrain without transferring destructive stress to body, panels, or mechanical components. Jeep could literally bend in the middle while maintaining traction with all 4 wheels. It was brilliant and completely counter to German engineering principles. Then came the body panels, flat steel stampings held together with simple bolts, no curves, no complex forms, no precision fitting. The hood was held down with a simple strap. The windshield folded flat, doors could be removed seconds. Everything was flat or angular, designed for the simplest possible manufacturing. German military vehicles featured carefully formed panels, precise tolerances, proper fitting and finishing. Quality was in the details, but the Jeep seemed to mock those details. Gaps between panels that would horrify a German inspector. Simple hinges instead of precision mechanisms. Exposed bolt heads everywhere. One engineer remarked that it looked like the designers had deliberately chosen the easiest possible manufacturing method for every single component, and he was right, but he didn't understand that this was genius, not laziness. The more they studied it, the more frustrated they became. Where was the sophistication? Where was the engineering excellence? This vehicle shouldn't work as well as field reports claimed it did. It violated too many principles of proper design. They brought in specialists in metallurgy to analyze the steel. Composition, standard grades, nothing special. They examined the welding. Competent but not exceptional. They studied the electrical system, basic and robust, using off-the-shelf components. Everything about the Jeep could have been built in any reasonably equipped factory. That was the point, but to engineers trained in German methods, it felt wrong. After months of analysis, the German engineers submitted their report, and it contained a confession that must have been difficult to write. They could not replicate the Jeep's capabilities without fundamentally changing their entire approach to vehicle manufacturing. The problem wasn't technical. They understood exactly how the Jeep was built. The problem was philosophical. The Jeep embodied an engineering approach that was alien to German industrial culture. German vehicles were designed by highly trained engineers working in specialized departments. Designs were refined through multiple iterations. Components were precision manufactured to tight tolerances. Quality control was rigorous. The result was vehicles that performed beautifully when properly maintained by trained mechanics using correct tools and genuine parts. Jeep was designed by a team that included mechanics, farmers, and soldiers, people who understood that vehicles would be maintained by 18-year-old kids using improvised tools in muddy fields under fire, people who knew that good enough delivered on time beat perfect delivered late. Every design choice in the Jeep prioritized field maintenance and repair. An average soldier could change a tire in 3 minutes, replace a water pump with basic tools in 20 minutes, swap an entire engine in a few hours using nothing but wrenches and a block and tackle truck. Doing that with a German equivalent. The wide tolerances that looked crude. They meant parts would still fit and function even when covered in mud and sand. The simple engine design, it could run on terrible fuel and survive neglect. That would destroy a precision engine. The flat body panels, they could be hammered out with a rock and still function. Damaged beyond repair, unbolt it and replace it. No welding or special tools required. German engineers had optimized for performance and precision. American engineers had optimized for maintainability and production, and in total war the latter proved valuable. The report's conclusion was damning. To replicate this vehicle, we would need to abandon many principles of proper engineering. We would need to accept larger tolerances, simpler designs, and construction methods. Our factories are not equipped for this type of production, and our engineers are not trained to think this way. Reading between the lines, the message was clear. The Jeep represented an entirely different industrial philosophy, and Germany could not adopt it without tearing down and rebuilding their entire automotive industry. In the middle of a war they were increasingly likely to lose. That was impossible. The Germans did produce a Jeep-inspired vehicle called the VW Type 82, but it never matched the original's capabilities or production numbers. Between 1940 and 1945, Germany produced about 50,000 cub wagons. In the same period, American factories churned out over 640,000 Jeeps. That production difference tells its own story. The Jeep was designed from the beginning for mass production by semi-skilled workers in rapidly built factories. It used common parts, required minimal tooling, and could be assembled quickly. American production techniques, pioneered by Henry Ford but refined by dozens of companies, could scale up incredibly fast. The Jeep story reveals something profound about industrial warfare. Germany entered World War II with arguably the most advanced military technology in the world. Their tanks were more sophisticated, their aircraft engines more powerful, their small arms more precisely manufactured, yet they Lost in part because sophistication is not the same as effectiveness. The United States understood something that Germany didn't fully grasp until too late. Modern war is won by industrial capacity as much as battlefield tactics. You don't need the best tank, you need enough good tanks that you can afford to lose some and still keep fighting. You don't need the perfect rifle, you need one that works reliably in the hands of millions of soldiers. The Jeep embodied this philosophy perfectly. It wasn't the best light vehicle possible, it was the best light vehicle that could be produced in massive numbers, maintained by ordinary soldiers, and still function reliably under terrible conditions. Consider the numbers. By war's end, Jeeps had served in every theater of conflict. They carried generals and privates, they mounted weapons from machine guns to rifles, they towed artillery, and trailers, they laid communication wire and transported wounded, they served as ambulances, reconnaissance vehicles, command posts, and personnel carriers, and they kept working. Stories abound of Jeeps running for years with minimal maintenance, surviving conditions that would destroy more sophisticated vehicles and being repaired in the field with improvised parts. One Jeep in Burma reportedly ran for 6 months after having its crankcase pierced by shrapnel. Soldiers just kept adding oil and it kept running. After the war, surplus Jeeps spread across the globe. Farmers bought them for field work, construction companies used them on job sites, remote communities relied on them for transportation where no roads existed. The design was so practical that copies appeared everywhere, from British Land Rovers to Japanese Land Cruisers to Soviet UAZs. The modern automotive world owes an enormous debt to the Jeep. Every SUV, every pickup truck, every utility vehicle traces its lineage back to that simple design created under impossible deadlines in 1940. The entire category of sport utility vehicles exists because the Jeep proved that a vehicle could be both utilitarian and desirable. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is philosophical. The Jeep taught engineers worldwide that simplicity is not the same as simplistic, that robust is better than refined, that maintainability matters more than initial perfection, that designing for the real world with its mud and mistakes and mediocre mechanics beats designing for ideal conditions that never exist. German engineering culture eventually adapted. Post-war German vehicles became more pragmatic, more focused on usability, but it took the hard lesson of the Jeep to teach them that their pursuit of perfection had sometimes led them away from what actually worked best. The genius behind the Jeep wasn't one person, it was a collaboration born of desperation and deadline. In 1940, the U.S. Army issued a requirement for a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle. They wanted it designed, prototyped, and ready for production in just 49 days. Impossible by conventional standards. 3 companies responded: Overland, American, and Ford. Each took a different approach to the problem, but all understood that this was no time for automotive elegance. American, a small company facing bankruptcy, moved fastest. Their chief engineer Carl created the initial design in just 2 days, working through the night with a drawing board and a slide rule. Probes later recalled, "I had to throw out everything I'd learned about proper automotive design. There was no time for refinement, no budget for complexity. Every component had to justify its existence or it didn't go in the vehicle." He designed while imagining the worst possible conditions: a mechanic working in darkness with frozen fingers, driver navigating terrain that would terrify a mountain goat, a factory worker assembling vehicles as fast as humanly possible. The Jeep emerged from these nightmare scenarios. Overland contributed the engine, a more powerful version that became standard. Ford provided manufacturing expertise and massive production capacity. The final Jeep was a hybrid incorporating the best ideas from all three companies. It was industrial collaboration at its finest, driven by urgency and purpose for the soldiers who drove them. The Jeep became more than transportation, it was a companion. Veterans wrote about their Jeeps with the same affection they reserved for fellow soldiers. They gave them names. They decorated them, they trusted them with their lives. Lieutenant who served in Europe wrote after the war, the Jeep was the most honest vehicle I've ever known. It never pretended to be comfortable or refined, but it never let you down in a world where everything was trying to kill you. That mattered more than you can imagine. Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent, described watching a Jeep pull a stuck truck from a mud hole in Italy. That little vehicle dug in and pulled like a Missouri mule. The bigger truck's crew looked embarrassed that they needed rescuing by something that weighed less than their spare tire. The bond between soldier and Jeep was so strong that when the war ended, many veterans tried to buy their vehicles and bring them home. The Army refused. Most were already sold as surplus, but that desire tells you everything about how these men felt about the machines that had carried them through hell. Back in that facility in Germany, as those engineers filed their final reports, they were documenting more than a vehicle analysis. They were recording the moment when German industrial supremacy met its match, not through superior technology but through superior philosophy. The Jeep wasn't the most powerful vehicle in World War II. It wasn't the fastest, the most comfortable, or the most heavily armed. It was simply the most useful, and usefulness, it turned out, was the ultimate form of sophistication. Those German engineers had been trained to see complexity as a virtue, to view precision as an end in itself. The Jeep forced them to confront a different truth, that sometimes the highest form of engineering is knowing what to leave out, that brilliance can manifest as simplicity, that the best solution might be the obvious one executed flawlessly. This philosophy gap extended beyond automotive design. It reflected fundamental differences in how America and Germany approached industrial warfare. Germany built magnificent weapons that required skilled operators and careful maintenance. America built good enough weapons that anyone could use and fix with a hammer. When you're fighting a global war, good enough wins when you need to equip millions of soldiers across 6 continents. Simple wins when you're operating in jungles and deserts and frozen tundra. Robust wins. The Jeep understood this from the first sketch. Today you can still find Jeeps running in remote corners of the world 70 or 80 years after they rolled off the assembly line. They're still doing their job, carrying people and cargo over terrible terrain, still simple enough that anyone with basic tools can keep them running. That's not just good engineering, that's immortal engineering. The story of the German engineers and the captured Jeep reminds us that genius doesn't always look sophisticated. Sometimes it looks like a boxy little vehicle with a flat hood and exposed hinges. Sometimes the most advanced solution is the one that refuses to be advanced. Those German engineers did eventually understand what made the Jeep special. Their reports show grudging respect, even admiration. They recognized that American engineers had solved a problem they hadn't even fully understood existed: how to create a vehicle that could win a war, not through excellence, but through sheer practicality. By overwhelming production, the Jeep wasn't just a vehicle, it was a philosophy on wheels. It was proof that democracy could outproduce dictatorship, that pragmatism could defeat perfectionism, that sometimes the simple answer is the right answer every time you see an SUV on the road. Every time you appreciate a tool that just works without fuss, you're seeing the legacy of those design choices made in desperate haste. In 1940, the Germans examined a captured Jeep and couldn't replicate its simplicity, because simplicity, as they discovered, is the hardest thing to engineer. It Requires confidence to do less, it takes courage to reject sophistication, it demands wisdom to know that the tool that works for everyone is better than the masterpiece that works for experts. That's the lesson the Jeep taught. That's why it matters, and that's why 8 decades later we're still telling its story, still marveling at how crude-looking little truck changed the world by refusing to be anything more complicated than exactly what was needed. The German engineers filed their reports, admitted defeat, and moved on to other projects. The Jeep kept bouncing across battlefields, carrying soldiers into history, proving every day that sometimes the greatest sophistication is knowing when to be simple.